Joan just told me about half an hour ago that she couldn't speak, so she asked if I'd fill in for her. So I'll apologise in advance if this sounds a bit fragmented and so on. But I thought there's four general points I wanted to make about where we stand at the minute as important sort of background information in relation to assessing the budget, and I suspect some of the other speakers will deal with some of the detail of what's in the budget. But we do know at this stage four things about what's going on in society out there. First of all, there's rapidly increasing poverty and hardship for most people. The risk of poverty has increased. Statistics just produced before the budget by the Central Statistics Office shows there was an increase in the level of poverty in Ireland. And this is in the context of the poverty level actually falling. Poverty is registered on a relative basis. The poverty line has actually come down because it's a portion of the average income. But in that context, levels of poverty are increasing. There are about 700,000 people at risk of poverty. About a third of these are children. And we also know that single parents, one of the groups hardest hit in the budget, have a poverty risk of about 1 in 5, much higher than the population in general. But we also know that what the CSO called deprivation is also increasing. And very interestingly, one of the measures that they use to measure deprivation, one of the indicators they use to measure deprivation, is the inability to afford heating. And there's been a very significant jump in the last year from 7% to 11% of the number of people responding to the CSO survey who say they're not in a position to afford heating on an ongoing basis. We also know from the work that the credit unions have been doing, they've been tracking what's left basically after you've paid your bills and so on. And we now know that the last piece of research they published in September tells us that about 45% of the population have less than €70 a month to spend after they've paid their bills. To put a real figure on that, that's 1.6 million people say they have about €70 a month left after they've paid the bills. And some of them don't even have enough to pay the bills that they have to pay. The second point is figures announced just today show that the jobs crisis is just absolutely escalating. And it's quite clear that a much better measure of what's happening in the jobs market is not the unemployment figure at all, which has increased by 16,000 in the household survey announced today, but the fact that the number in employment has actually declined by 46,000. You know, people who become unemployed don't necessarily get measured as unemployed because they go away, they emigrate and so on. So a much better measure of what's going on, as said, is there's been a decline in 46,000 jobs in the last year. And most worryingly, in the last 3 months, there's been a loss of about 20,000 jobs, which is 4 times greater than the previous 3 months. And we also know, which accounts for a lot of the deprivation that should have been measured in these various surveys, about half of the unemployed, about 56% of the unemployed, have now been unemployed for more than a year. So what we're seeing out there, actually, is the immiserization of working people. And it's not a slogan or a piece of propaganda by the left. There's plenty of official statistics to show that they're impoverishing working people. And at the same time, this is the third point I want to make, the wealth of those who are really wealthy in society is increasing. In the same piece of research produced by the CSO, we now know that the top fifth of income earners have an income 5.5 times the bottom 20%. And that has risen. It was 4.3 a year ago. The figure 4.3 times the income of the bottom 20%. It's gone up. They now have 5.5 times the income of the bottom 20%. And we also know, because we wrote it up very clearly in the ULA pre-budget submission, that the wealthy in this country are getting wealthier in the context of this immiserization that I've talked about. We knew from earlier on in the year that the rich list showed that the top 300 people in the country, their wealth increased by about 7 billion in the last year. But we know now from estimates that we have done, based on CSO data, that the top 1% in the country have about 132 billion between them, and the top 5% have about 220 billion between them. On every indicator, the wealth of the rich is actually increasing. The figure on which we base this on which was the net financial assets, which doesn't include property. I mean, houses and land and so on. We show very clearly that over the last 2 years, 2008 to 2010, the net financial assets of the rich had increased by about 45 billion. Now, these are real figures. We're not making them up. And they demonstrate very clearly that the rich are getting richer and the poor are clearly getting poorer. And at the same time, while we're all being called to be patriotic and help the country out and accept cuts and wage cuts and so on, these rich people have gone on strike. The level of investment have absolutely plummeted. It's fallen by about 30 billion in the last 3 years. They're not investing because they don't feel the climate is right for them to make profits. And after all, that's why capitalists invest, because they want to make money, and they don't believe, regardless of the patriotic duties that we're all expected to perform, that they should invest and create jobs in these times. The other thing we know, the fourth point I want to make, is the cost of the bank bailouts is not going to go down in any sense. Very interesting article by a UCD economist in Business and Finance recently showed that the ongoing bill to the taxpayer for the bailout of Anglo will be about 3.1 billion a year up to 2023. And that we still won't have paid the full bill. And doesn't the 3.1 figure almost match the 3.8 billion in cuts and tax increases that for us, because there's no tax increases in this budget for the wealthy, that the government announced in the budget. So, what can we conclude from this? Well, very clearly the budget has hit all the wrong targets. It's hit poor people, marginalised people, single parents, the unemployed, people working in C schemes and so on, all of them absolutely hammered by the budget, with not a penny. In fact, tax breaks for new corporations have been extended, not a penny taken off the wealthy. Secondly, what this shows us is the resources are there. The money is there. They keep asking, where is this money for this alternative policy that you want to produce, but you want to pursue? We say the money is there. You put a 5% tax on the top 5% of wealth holders, we get 10 billion immediately. And what we say in our submission, invest that into jobs, in productive jobs, which meet people's social needs and don't just enrich the few in society. And thirdly, it tells us that having Labour in government makes not a blind bit of difference. There is no difference at all between what's in this budget and the general policy that's pursued than was in the budgets introduced by the Fianna Fáil and Green coalition. So, what we can also say is very broadly, the ULA has absolutely been right in the approach that it's adopted. The ULA has been based on two fundamental principles. Coalitionism is not a viable strategy for the left. If you go into coalition with the right, this is what happens. And secondly, depending on the market to address the crisis is an error. As we said in our founding statements, there's no just or sustainable solution to the current crisis based on the capitalist market. And it goes on to say, is we favour democratic and public control over resources so that social needs are prioritised over profit. So the simple slogan, put people before profit, it wasn't done in this budget. The enriched are continuing to be enriched and the poor will be made poorer. And will be made worse, and maybe someone else will take this up, by the EU agreement that was published at the weekend. They're now looking for a 0.5% deficit limit to be written into the constitutional law of states, which will mean, look at the problems we're having with a state policy that's aimed at getting us to a 3% deficit. They will absolutely immiserise people if state policy is based on a limit of 0.5%. It will also exclude the possibility, because we're not against borrowing, we want investment in jobs, in education and health and so on. This will institutionalise austerity in the Constitution. So we need to oppose it. Perhaps we can discuss that, because I think it's one possibility that will open up for us into the future. So, we may all be, perhaps, and this is one of the discussions that have been going on in the ULA, disappointed perhaps by the level of response to the strategies that the state is employing. We have sought to mobilise people correctly around various campaigns. We worked very hard to build for the Trades Council March. I personally think it was a relative success. Some people to view us as quite disappointed by the turnout and so on. But what it teaches us is this, and I'll finish on this simple point. If we're going to proceed from here and develop and build the United Left Alliance, it has to be done, first of all, in a united fashion. We have to agree that by working together, concentrating our resources on building serious campaigns against austerity, we can have a real effect. And secondly, that a sustainable campaign against austerity can only be built from below. The notion of waiting for trade union leaders to call us out and then tell us to go home again is not a viable strategy at all. In fact, that strategy up to now has now demoralised layers of people within the trade union movement who are scurrilous and are cynical about the manoeuvres of the leadership. So we want to build sustainable, ongoing opposition to austerity. We're going to have to get really stuck in and build it from below. So I leave it with that. I think we need to have a discussion about these things. Obviously, this is a social event and so on, but I think there are serious challenges for us, and we need to discuss them out. Thanks very much.